Hello everyone, Ron again, and in this video we're going to talk about enhancing the kick drum. In the last video we talked about unmasking the kick drum from the bass, and so this is a continuation along with this little track that I made up to explain this topic. I may add more to it later, but for right now this is all it is. Anyway, let's get into it. So the first thing I did to the kick was to add a compressor, and we're focused on Neutron 3 elements. In the video where I was describing it, I talked about liking it because it's like a Swiss Army knife. I don't think I said Swiss Army knife in that video, but that's kind of what it is. It's like a little toolbox where you just have just what you need, you know? And it makes it simpler in a way because you don't have so many options. You know, you have tons of plugins. Like, you look here, you have all this stuff to choose from that you could possibly do to something. And it can be daunting because sometimes you're like, where do I begin? So when you have less options in particular things, it can be better, especially using one plugin because it's less CPU intensive. So with that being said, the first thing I did was to compress it. Now, talking about compression, when the average sound level is higher, we perceive a sound to be closer. So compression, to reduce the dynamic range, makes something sound closer. So naturally, the same would be true of a kick drum. It's going to sound a bit more clear because it's going to sound a bit louder, and things that are louder feel like they're closer to us. So that's the first step. The second step was to EQ. Because another part of something feeling closer or more clear is that it has more high frequencies. So I didn't do anything crazy, and I just made slight boosts in these areas, and there's a high shelf, which is the opposite of a low shelf. It's raising all the frequencies that are above that point, and so it's really simple. The last thing I did to it was called Transient Shaping, which is exactly what it sounds like once you know what a transient is. So, to recap briefly, a transient is just the initial sound as any sound is created. It's just like the first strike, but a drum itself has very little sustain and is pretty much just a transient. It decays rapidly. So you increase the attack, and Isotope, they just released a video on Instagram actually that I watched. And Nick Tello, he was talking about decreasing the sustain and doing that in the low end. And that's more or less what I had done. It's the same thing, to add some punchiness to the kick drum after doing all the other stuff to it. And you could use the final module here, the exciter, if you wanted to create interesting effects through adding distortion to a kick drum, but I didn't do that because I wanted to keep this simple. You know, also to me, it's not that kind of song. But I'm just gonna have the audio examples and briefly go through the different examples, and you can hear the change for yourself. And then I'll explain one final thing, and then that'll be it. This video is real simple. So I'm gonna start with everything bypassed, and I'm gonna add them in one at a time. We can listen for the differences, and beware that some changes may be very subtle. You know, there's a subtlety in when you produce music. You make small changes that accumulate over time. You don't necessarily make one huge EQ curve all the time, and that gets you to where you want to go. So that's why it's called mixing. It's kind of like stirring broth. You know, what you want to do is you want to aim to blend everything together in a way that sounds good, sort of like a chef, you know? So that's what we're aiming for here. And I am going to unbypass these one at a time. And you can hear the changes, and then I'll go over them. Then there'll be one more thing, then the video will be done. So here we go. So as you can hear, when I added the compressor to the sound, it sort of evens out the dynamic of the kick, and it makes it feel a bit more round. And I chose these compressor settings with the idea in mind that I was going to try to preserve as much of the transient as I could while still getting a bit of compression to tighten the later end. When I was EQing, I was thinking about where I felt like I should increase the frequencies so that the top end of the kick drum would stand out more, and I'll get into why that is right after explaining the transient shaper. And here I was just going for a bit more knock because now that the top end was to my liking, because I feel that it sounds good here and it's where I want it to be. That's key. You make something with the hopes that other people will like it, but when you create, you really create what you love and then you share it. So that's the idea. You have to like it yourself. It's less important what anybody else thinks because it'd be like, again, going back to food metaphors, if you cooked, then you wanted to eat. If everybody else likes your cooking, then it's less important compared to whether you do. Like, you wouldn't make a meal for yourself that you didn't like, right? You would make a meal that you like and then you would give everybody else a piece. So that's the idea here. Now, it occurs to me that if I was watching this and learning, and possibly this is a thing I've come up against too, that I would think, why does my cell phone not reproduce this bass? You know? But in this context, you might be tempted to simply just do this. You're like, well, I need more kick drum, so I'm gonna just increase it, and then now it's gonna knock, right? And that's enough. But no, because in addition to the fact that something has to sound good where you are in your room, given its dynamics and acoustics and level of treatment, it's also got to translate well. And cell phones do not reproduce a lot of these frequencies that are down here. So you want to make a kick that's going to stand out, and hopefully it's going to play on the cell phone too. So that's why the high end of the kick drum is important as well. And it's good because it brings clarity. So you may not have to do as much in the grand scheme of things. I mean, there's always the idea that maybe later on, when you're doing the final mix down, you're going to have like tonal balance control or something. It's going to say maybe there's not enough kick down here or bass or whatever. But you can deal with that later. You know, maybe you'll have to do this even. I was watching Are You Listening by Jonathan Weiner, and he was talking about removing some of the low end to even out the distribution of the tonality in the entire spectrum. But if you're mixing and the kick is the majority of that, or even the bass, as I showed in the last video, then you could do that in the mix. So keep that in mind. This is for the purpose of it translating well to a cell phone. And you could think of this as evening out the kick so the thump is consistent across the whole kick. Increasing the upper frequencies so it's going to stand out a bit more on a cell phone. Because I did test it on a separate speaker that's not a studio monitor that is of lesser quality. That's another technique I've been using because if it sounds good there, it will probably translate well to a phone. And that speaker is here without me having to do a car test. So it's like doing a car test while mixing. You know, and then the transient shaper, after adding that upper level to the kick, is just to add a slight bit more thump. Because I don't want for the kick to necessarily punch you in the face when you're in the car. I don't want you to feel like it's on your center console. But I do want you to feel it. And maybe this may not be the final thing that I decide to do with it. But that's just how I like it for now. Because there's no pressure to get it perfect the first time. You know, some things you may consider perfect throughout music production or whatever else you do. But it's rare, if ever, that you don't have to make slight adjustments and that you just simply nail it and it's perfect and lovely right off the jump. An easy way to think about that is if you know anything about mastering, I might have to add a limiter to this. And because of bass frequencies being the loudest, the limiter usually affects them more than it does higher frequencies. So I have to consider that too. Also, down the line, if I'm mastering a song that I myself mixed and I did this to it, the limiter might just cut a lot of that off. You know, so it's about the process and the workflow and thinking about what's going to happen later, how somebody's going to hear it when it gets to, say, even a streaming service, potentially. I have to think about the dynamic range because I might apply limiting to it. I might do a pre-master. What if somebody else mastered it, you know, and then they were just going to undo that EQ cut? And that might be the first thing. You know, they might say you have too much bass and the tonal balance is off. So there's a million reasons for why you wouldn't just, you know, increase the bass or make the volume of the kick louder as a means to try to make it stand out more. Because you could also do this and just turn up the fader afterward. You could go to the mixer track, look at the kick, and just add gain plugins, you know? But there's a reason why that doesn't work. And so those are the reasons that I'm covering in this video. And with that being said, I hope that you got something out of it. I hope that this is clear. And, you know, always feel free to leave suggestions or feedback in the comments. I'm always welcoming it, especially topics for videos too, because making a video every day, it forces you to be creative in ways that are more than just musical. You know, creative as in, like, this is a curriculum sort of thing, but that really feels cool though. It's like being a teacher. But with that, I thank you for watching and have an awesome day as always. Peace.